The Elder Scrolls is a universe filled to the brim with things that we would consider mundane. Things that we would look at and think nothing of. But at the same time, it's also filled with what we would consider the exact opposite of that. Things that render the world that all those mundane things exist within far from anything that resembles that mundanity at all. Nothing fits this contradiction to the mundanity more than the gods that inhabit said universe. Gods that not only are the reason as to why it exists in the first place, but, aside their Daedra counterparts, are the reason why all things that at some point refused to change were forced to do so, and gods that perhaps may be the reason why it all ends. An ending that, alongside its beginning, will be explored as we delve further into the lore of these gods, and as such, find out not only what they are, but why they exist, and perhaps even more. As with all these Elder Scrolls lore videos, I'll preface this by saying that everything that I say in these videos is based on the current canon that is accepted by the larger lore community, and as such is all contextually based within things such as lore books, games, novels, and any other sort of officially recognized Bethesda work. If I do ever make any reference to theory or non-canon events in these videos, I will always mention as such, but for the most part I'll stick to what is confirmed canon within the universe, as well as not diving too deeply into each of the gods' lore, as this video is really just an overview. That being said, and without further ado, let's get right into the video. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what and who each god is, it's best to understand that when I say god in this context, I'm generally referring to the Aedra, as well as some at Ada, and any mortals that have managed to transcend their physical bonds. That being said, I will of course mention, right now to be exact, that I will not be talking at all about Daedra, even if they are worshipped as gods in pantheons such as the Dunmeri one. In addition to this, as to shorten the length of the following few videos on the gods of Tamriel, I'll be splitting the gods into three categories: gods accepted by a large majority of cultures, gods accepted by a lesser majority, and gods who were at some point mortal, with gods like Talos being the exception for these categories. This video, then, will be talking about the first category, the largely accepted gods, with at least 3 cultures accepting them as qualification. All that aside, I think that to begin talking about the gods of Tamriel, it would be best to at least quantify them as well as their more general names. To begin with, there are a total of 15 widely accepted gods that exist, though not all by the same cultures, with those 15 gods being Akatosh, Arcade, Dibella, Julianos, Kinnereth, Shezer, Trinimac, Mara, Magnus, Finastre, Stendar, Siribane, Xarxes, Ephrae, and Zenithar, most of which of course have different names in various cultures. The first of the more widely accepted gods is Akatosh, known by the Imperials, Nords, and Bretons as such, Auriel by the Falmer, Altmer and Bosmer, Ruptga or Talpapa by the Redguard, and Alkosh by the Khajiit. Akatosh, which Auriel is just the elven representation of, is typically referred to as the chief deity of the divines and the dragon god of time, with his avatar reflecting that name in the form it takes. He's generally associated with being the first of the original spirits, also known as the Ada, and as such assumes the role of the progenitor, embodying endurance, invincibility, and everlasting legitimacy, while at the same time promoting various virtues such as duty and service. It should also be noted that in the case of the Nordic Pantheon, and to some extent the Imperial and Breton ones, Akatosh is seen to be a god that is not quite whole, with his most notable separate part being Alduin, the god that was to bring upon the end times, though with the events of the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, that's no longer the case. For now. In addition to all this, Akatosh is also known to have supreme power over time, controlling, to some extent, the Kalpic cycle that we know to play over and over again, with the most notable breaking of this time, known as Dragon Breaks, being associated with his temporary loss of the control of time. In the case of his elven equivalent, Auriel, which can be seen as a previous form of Akatosh, he is attributed more so to being the king of the gods rather than dragons. It should also be noted that Auriel is claimed by elves such as the Bosmer and Altmer to be their progenitor, with them tracing their lineage back to him as such. As for the various events surrounding Akatosh and Auriel throughout history, the pact that Akatosh formed with the Imperials, the one concerning Daedra and protection from them, as well as its fulfillment in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, is perhaps the most notable of them, at least in recent history. Though the story behind Auriel, specifically that involving the creation of Mundus and the death of Lorkhan, and his creation of various artifacts, is definitely much more impactful on Nirn as a whole. But with those clearer representations of the Time God out of the way, we can now focus on the two that are a lot less fleshed out in the Elder Scrolls universe. In particular, Ruptga and Alkosh. In the case of Ruptga, the mythology around him has a lot to do with how the Redguards believe themselves to be of another Kalpa, or at least a previous one, with their pantheon's mythos revolving around how Ruptga, after learning how to overcome Sadakal, the Redguard equivalent of Alduin, made a path in the stars to help the other gods and spirits walk around, hence allowing them to live more than one life, all of which seems to be a metaphor for the Kalpic cycle that was created. There's also mention of how Ruptga created Sep, the equivalent to Lorkhan, from the ruins of the old world in order to help him guide spirits to the new one. But, as his namesake already predicts, Sep convinced the other spirits to make a workaround to the walkaround that Ruptga had already made, inadvertently trapping many spirits in his new patchwork of a world, hence forcing Ruptga, as the Redguards say, to hit him with a big stick. Though even after this, Sep refused to save the stranded spirits, hence forcing them to find their own way to the far shores, the Redguard name for afterlife. Moving on then, the last and perhaps least known variant of Akatosh is Alkosh, known by the Khajiit as the Great Cat King of Time. He's essentially everything that the other forms of him are, but as stated by the Khajiit, is just a really big cat, which is what they believe all dragons are. With all that being said, it can be safe to assume that all the various representations and names of Akatosh in the various cultures refer to the same god, with almost every story, with a few details as exceptions, mirroring what the others say. Even in the cultures where Akatosh isn't present, at least in name, his defining characteristics still remain present, like with Almalexia replacing him during the time of the Tribunal, and will probably continue to do so for eons to come. Something that can also be said about what many believe to be an inevitability of all mortals: death. A spear managed by none other than the god of death, Arkay. Arkay, being the second of the more widely accepted gods to be listed, is also one of the more popular, existing with the name Arkay in the Imperial, Bosmeri, and Breton pantheons, and with the name Tawaka in the Redguard pantheon. Though whatever his name may be, his role is roughly the same. He is the god of life and death, guiding many to the afterlife and protecting them from necromancy, with Arkay taking on the name of the Lord of the Wheels of Life because of it. It should also be noted that because of his role, he is hated greatly by necromancers, with some going so far as to name him their greatest enemy, as their magics can't raise those blessed by Arkay. This then leads us to his origin, of which there are two major accounts. The first comes from the book Arkay, the God of Birth and Death, in which Arkay is but a normal shopkeeper who has a thirst for knowledge. In this tale, he spends years and years deciphering this book, which is in some sort of strange language, ignoring the world around him as he does so for those many long years, finally discovering that the book holds the secrets to life and death. At this point, he was at death's door though, with an incurable disease at that, at which point he prayed to Mara in order to live long enough to decipher the book. Though, in a strange twist, he is offered death, or the ability to become a god, perhaps referencing how long it would take him to understand the book, of which he chooses the latter. The other tale of how Arkay came to be is one that we already know, the one about how he was one of the first original spirits alongside others like Akatosh, and as the plane of Mundus developed, he took a role in it as it did so, of which this one seems much more realistic than the prior. The counterpoint then to Arkay, as previously mentioned, is Tawaka, the Redguard or Yakutan god of souls, with Tawaka mirroring almost every aspect of Arkay, even being interchangeable in some regions of Hammerfell. The only real difference comes down to how they came to be, with the Yakuden one being much more closely related to the tale of Ruptga and the Walkaround, where Tawaka used to be the god of absolutely nothing until Ruptga gave him the job of guiding souls to the far shores. Aside of that, the differences between the two are minor, and as with Akatosh, essentially mirror the same god in every way. With Arche out of the way, we can move on to Dibella, the goddess of beauty, love, and affection, and a god that is worshipped in 3 known pantheons, the Imperial, Nordic, and Breton ones to be exact. In terms of origin then, Dibella doesn't have any special myths around her, and as such tends to roam around the monomyth in the standard original spirit's origin, with Dibella simply taking on the role to fill the space for it. In terms of teachings and the like, Dibella is known to spread love and kindness, though not to the same extent as a god such as Mara. Instead, Dibella and her priesthood dabble in the more promiscuous arts, with many going so far as to criticize her and her worshippers as being overly lustful rather than devout and holy. That being said, Dibella's worship throughout the various provinces and cultures of Tamriel has stuck to the same sort of template that we see in games like Skyrim, with a priesthood consisting of purely women and typically delving heavily into the Dibellan arts, while also being immensely kind to those around them. Though Dibella's greatest influences on the mortal realm have come more so from her artifacts than anything else, with things such as the brush of true paint allowing those who use it to paint whatever their mind imagines, be it real or fake, though that one is a tale for another time. That said, it seems, like with the previous 2 gods, that Dibella is also essentially the same god in every pantheon, and as such, doesn't really have much more lore attached to her, without diving into the specifics of course. So, on to the next god. Julianos is the god of wisdom and logic, and exists in 3 pantheons that we know of, with these pantheons being the Imperial, Nordic, and Breton ones, just like with Dibella. Julianos, as his title would imply, is the patron god of literature, law, history, and contradiction, with him generally residing over magic and as such being revered by wizards. His temples along the Iliac Bay are known as places of learning, and as such, his followers are the dedicated keepers of the Elder Scrolls. That being said, Julianos in the Nordic Pantheon takes the name of Junal, the rune god. He is the Nordic god of hermetic order, mathematics, and language, though for some reason he fell out of favor in his pantheon, moving to the Imperial one as the legend goes, which explains a lot in 4th Era Skyrim. This sadly seems to be the extent of what we know about Julianos, as he is yet to be fully explored in the more modern games, and as a result has sparse if barely any true lore behind him. Though, in terms of things like origin, it would be safe to group him up with the origin of the other gods in the monomyth, not to mention how he was spoken of by Vivek as being one of the 8 known worlds, perhaps in reference to his celestial body, which takes the form of a planet. The next widely accepted god then is Kynareth, being perhaps one of the most widely worshipped gods on this list. Kynareth is in the Imperial, Nordic, Yakuden, Breton, and Khajiit pantheons. It seems that in general, Kynareth is the goddess of the elements, specifically the air and wind, something that allows for her not only to be a patron god of sailors and travelers, but may have played a key role when the Nordic version of her, Kine, taught the Nords how to speak the tongue of the dragons, the Thun. It is also said in legends that Kynareth was the first to agree to Lorkhan's plan to create Mundus, and upon his death was the first to bring rain since his divine spark was removed. It should also be noted that Lorkhan's Nordic representation, Shor, is believed to have been the husband of Kine, and that rain was in fact Kine mourning him. Outside of this representation of Kynareth, there is also the Khajiit one in the form of Kynarthi, and the Yakuden one in the form of Tava, where Kynarthi simply acts as the guiding shaman in the Khajiit mythos, and Tava as the one who guided the Redguard from their sunken homeland of Yakuta to the island of Hern. Speaking of Kine, the next god on the list is Shezer, god of creation as well as trickery and the like, though Shezer's true story lies behind quite the muddled wreckage of various cultural influences. To start off, Shezer is the imperial name, while Shor is the Nordic, Lorkhan is the one used by the elves, Set by the Redguards, Shior by the Bretons, and lastly Lorkaj by the Khajiit. As such, there's plenty of room for variation on the god's true intent and nature, with the elves seeing him as the problem, while many of the human races seeing him as their savior. Though whatever the case may have been, it can essentially be boiled down to Lorkhan, or whatever his respective pantheon representation was, wanting to make their own plane of existence, and in the process being found out for some sort of deception or mistake they made, with Akatosh and his fellow gods punishing the representation for what he did. The notable changes to this are the previously mentioned one involving Sepp with the Red Guards, the change that the Imperials made where Auriel essentially rebelled against Shezzer in jealousy and hate, the Nordic spin where Shor, who they believed to be the chief deity, was essentially killed by elven giants and his heart was hidden so that he may never be whole, as well as a slew of other things involving decreased Nordic lifespans and the War of the First Council. The elven spin where Lorkhan is seen as a trickster who stole divinity from all the Aata and bound them to Mundus before being righteously killed by Auriel and his followers, keenly Trinimac who tore his heart out, with his heart being shot out to the current location of Red Mountain by Auriel, and his body becoming the moon's Secunda and Master. The Breton account that labels Shior as the bad man who brings crop failure, and of course the Khajiit version that essentially makes him into a giant cat god that tricked the other gods into creating Mundus, only then to be killed and eventually forgiven by the spirit of Nirn, also known as Nirni, for allowing it to create children within itself, with the mirror being an evil that was birthed from Lorkaj. All in all, each and every culture surrounding Shezzer and his various incarnations holds some truth to them, especially when it comes to how the races see him as the creator, as this fact was not only confirmed by members of the tribunal, such as Solthicil and Vivek, but almost enforced to some degree when they had ruled Morrowind. However, unlike the other gods, or at least some of the other gods, Shezzer is bound to Mundus at a base level, and whatever happens to him, as well as his various artifacts, and perhaps even his followers, may forever affect the fate of Mundus and the various other planes, though that may be a story for another time. Moving on then to the next god, we have the very one that killed Lorkhan, Trinimac. Now, unlike the other gods on this list, there are major schisms on what exactly Trinimac was and is, and for that reason, and that reason exclusively, I will talk, to some extent, about the Daedric counterpart to Trinimac, Malakath. That being said, Trinimac is the name that the elves and some of the orcs, primarily those from Orsinium, use, while Moloch and Orki are the Nordic names, Malakath the Dunmer and cultist one, and Maluk the Yakuden one. Trinimac, then, was known to be the strongest of the Aata, known to be a great warrior who at some point was the spirit that led the ancient elven tribes to war against the armies of mankind. At some point, however, Trinimac was challenged by the Daedric prince Boethia to a fight, the reason of which some believe to be that Trinimac was spreading lies about Lorkhan, one that he inevitably lost, resulting in the god being eaten by Boethia and as a result being transformed to the Daedric prince Malakath as Boethia released him from within their body. It's also at this point that many things involving Trinimac would change. It's said that the Chimer elves that kept following and believing in Malakath, even in his twisted state, became the orcs, while those who listened to Boethia and went on an exodus to the northeastern shores of Tamriel became the Dunmer. From here on out, all involvement that Trinimac would have in the various pantheons are seen in a negative light, as it was most likely the disfigured Daedric prince form, if it's to be believed that Boethia did not take on his visage after they ate him, that had done all of this. Nevertheless, the Nordic form of Trinimac came in the form of two gods, the first being Moloch, the mountain fart, a god, if the tales are to be believed, that caused a great amount of trouble for the heirs of the Nordic king Harald. The second, then, is Orki, the trickster god that is believed to be a mixture of Arche and Malakath. In his tale, it is told that he tricked the Atmorans into giving away their almost elven-like lifespans long ago, then once more convincing Alduin into consuming every soul at the age of 6, only for him to be foiled by the Nordic king Ysmir, who reversed this curse in exchange for years off his own life. There's also Maluk, the Yakuden version of Trinimac. In this pantheon, he plays the role of the villain as well, acting as the enemy god that led hordes of goblins against the Redguard. At least until Hunding, another god, stopped him. Lastly then, there's Malakath in general. If the orcs are to be believed, at least those who worship Trinimac rather than the prince, then Malakath is simply Boethia in disguise, manipulating the Mer into their devious plot. If this isn't the case, then Malakath, as stated earlier, is in fact a Daedric prince created as waste product of the battle between Boethia and Trinimac, and as such is a shadow of his former glory. It should be noted that while not entirely accepted as a race, goblins do in fact worship a deity like Malakath known as Moloch, the god of the goblins, though his exact relationship to Malakath or Trinimac is unknown. Nonetheless, this goes to show the variety of different views that races within Tamriel can have of the same god. Be it that they see him as false or true, there's always bound to be something in there that's based on reality. Moving on then to a less obscure god, we have Mara. Known as the goddess of love, marriage, and fertility, Mara exists within the Imperial, Nordic, Breton, Altmer, Aeliad, Bosmer, and Khajiit pantheons, with only the Yakuden one referring to her as a different name, Morwa. Though, no matter the culture, Mara embodies the same virtues and beliefs. That is, to promote love and mutual understanding amongst each of the inhabitants of Tamriel, especially amongst enemies and the impoverished. The only notable difference between the general Tamriel Mara and the Yakuden Morwa is their appearance, where Morwa is said to have many arms as to grab more husbands. Though, it should be noted that in every pantheon, she's seen as the wife of Akatosh. Outside of all this, and of course her typical monomythic origin, there really isn't much else to Mara as a god, and as such, nothing more can be dissected without digging in too deeply. The next god then is Magnus, known as a prominent Aada and god of magic. He is worshipped as such in the Aeliad, Altmer, and Breton pantheons, and is Magrus by the Khajiit. In terms of history then, he is widely believed to have been the architect of Mundus, and is attributed to being the one to have drawn up the schematics that allowed for its creation. At some point into his construction, however, Magnus, alongside some other at Aada, came to realize that the realm's creation would result in them losing their forms and even their power, hence convincing him to abandon the project and flee to Aetherius, tearing a hole in the sky that would become the sun. The stars, then, are believed to either have been other at Aada who followed him in an escape, hence earning them the name Magnagae, or fragments of his own being that he left behind. Whatever the case may be, Magnus's work has made him a widely worshipped deity in Tamriel, with entire celebrations, like the New Life Festival, originally being dedicated to him. The god after Magnus on this list is Pinastri. Though very little is known about him, it can be confirmed that he's essentially a hero god of Altmer, Bretons, and Falmer, credited with teaching the Altmer on how to live longer lives by walking, quote, shorter strides, unquote. In terms of origin, then, the best we can perceive is that he is one of the Aada, based on how he is talked about by the Altmer at least. Though this seems to be the extent to which we know about him, outside of his artifact, of course. Stendarr, then, is the next god on the list, known commonly by his name in the Imperial, Altmer, Aeliad, and Breton pantheons, Stan in the Nordic, and Strendar in the Khajiit. He is also primarily seen as the patron god of charity, justice, and mercy. That said, Stendarr was originally worshipped as the Nordic equivalent Stun for many years as the god of ransom, brother of Sun and Shield Thane of Shore, but later became developed into a god of righteousness and compassion as his worship spread. In terms of differences between the three names, there isn't much. The only real difference comes with the origin of Strendar, where in the Khajiit mythos he is the runt of the godhood litter, hence why he got the title of God of Mercy, and the cultural implications of him in Nordic mythology, with him being more of a vanguard in that case. Outside of those differences, many are negligible, and overall simply confine Stendarr to being worshipped via his followers being caring individuals who help those in need often, and stand up for what they believe in. The next god, then, is Sirabane, typically referred to in elven cultures as the warlock's god. He is said to have aided an old Clovian king named Bendu Olo, as well as the Altmer in defeating the Slode many ages ago. He is also known as the patron saint of apprentices, as he was a favorite of many in the Mages Guild. There's also a great amount of hinting that Sirabane was in fact mortal at some point, and only rose to god status due to the feats he accomplished. However, the only reason he is on this particular list is because of the fact that he is so widely recognized, and by Myr nonetheless. The next god is Xerxes, worshipped once again purely by Myr, and known most commonly as the god of ancestry and knowledge, or the Ageless One. He is believed to have been ascribed to Auriel himself, keeping track of various Aldmeri accomplishments since the beginning of time, going so far as to supposedly create his own wife, Ogma, from the parts of history that he enjoyed most. A name that would come up later in history when the Daedric prince Hermaeus Mora was known to say that all the information he gave Xerxes was recorded in the Ogma Infinium, perhaps pointing to his wife having more contextual meaning. Nevertheless, Xerxes is worshipped primarily by scholar priests in modern-day Somerset, with some devoting their entire lives into understanding lineage and how it intertwines with history. The second to last god, then, is quite a mysterious one. known by a variety of names, but most commonly to Breton's Bosmer and Aliads as Ifre, while being known as Jeffrey to the Altmer and Falmer, and Ifer to the Khajiit. He is known most commonly as the god of song and forest, and is also the most important god in the Bosmeri Pantheon. In fact, it's said that he was the first to become an Elnofit, as well as the first to give rise to the earthbones and as such the frames of the mortal planes, creating the laws that govern nature and all the lands that came from his frames. Things such as animals, day and night, as well as the coalescing of the plane are all but his interpretation of previously existing things, such as time from Akatosh. Most notably, however, Ifre created the green, essentially being the plant life that spreads from Valenwood, as well as teaching all that lived there how to sing and more so how to tell stories. This would ultimately come together into what became known as the Green Pact between Ifre and the Bosmer, in which they would agree to never harm the green in return for the ability to sing to the green and let it grow to their song. For this reason, any who break the pact incite the Wild Hunt, in which they return to the primal ooze of which Ifre shaped the world, becoming feral and savage as a result. In addition to all this, it's believed that at some point, Argonians who had escaped the Ebonheart Pact back in the time of the Three Banners War made an attempt to create a pact with Ifre in order to reproduce outside of the Hist. Sadly, this all ended with the Argonians being assassinated by a shadow scale at some point later down the line, and the heresy therefore being ended. In terms of worship, Ifre has perhaps given his priests the most amount of power out of any that exists. Not only can his spinners weave together beautiful stories and record those of their own, but they can also alter other people's stories, be it past or present. A fact that hints greatly towards a form of tonal magic that we have yet to fully understand. Though that's just a theory. All that being said, there really aren't many cultural differences between the various pantheons in relation to Ifre, though it should be noted that Ifre has a notable exclusion from the imperial Nordic pantheons. As to why? Well, there aren't very many clear reasons. The last god then, on the list of widely accepted gods, is known by very many names. Most keenly is Zenithar by the Imperials and Bretons, Sun by the Nords, Zen by the Altmer, Zaen by the Bosmer, and Zet by the Redguards. His realm of influence encompasses that of commerce, prosperity, and trade, with the god being most influential in more trade and nobility-centric societies, like those of High Rock and Cyrodiil. That being said, his Nordic equivalent Sun is the god of trial and adversity, standing constantly over the whalebone bridge before the great mead hall in Sovngarde, acting as a trial to any who enter the final resting place of the warriors. The last major variation of Zenithar, then, is Zaen, the Bosmeri god of Toil. Originally having influence from both Akavir and Argonian culture, it's said that his influence spreads far beyond hard work and agriculture, though its extents aren't known. Sadly, it's not known if any Zaen worshippers remain at all, as the Nahatan flu wiped out nearly all temples and places of worship to the god of Toil in Valenwood. Altogether then, it seems as though Zenithar generalizes himself in multiple cultures as the god of work, with each pantheon having its own unique take on what they consider hard work, all of which are of course tailored to fit their society's specific needs. But with all that said, it seems as though the more widely accepted gods list has finally come to an end. But fear not, as the tale is not over. In fact, it's far from over, as there are many more gods remaining in the Elder Scrolls universe, some of which have had just as much, if not more influence than those mentioned in this video, despite their lack of wide worship, with some of those gods not even being original spirits to begin with, and others simply being those who were slowly forgotten and faded from history, or both. But nevertheless, that is a tale that will be discussed in a video to come, and as such is a story for another time.
Got me a bitch from Akatosh. She's a blockhead. You need to cast that mother blockhead. Ever bitch, you overweight. You niggas be some blockhead haters. All you do is hate when I'm a dangerous and I don't hear what you niggas say. What you say? Hey. What you say? Hey. You niggas smoking, fucking, root, and your breath is saying. What you say?